Picture this, a desolate, snow-covered landscape in the Ural Mountains of Russia. It's February 2nd, 1959, and a group of 9 adventurous young hikers set out on an expedition into the wilderness, seeking adventure. They wanted to complete a Category 3 hike, which was one of the most difficult routes during that hiking season. The adventure started with a group of 10 hikers, led by their fearless leader, Igor Dyaltov. The goal of the hike through the Ural Mountains was to travel to Ortoten, a mountain peak deep inside the Russian mountains. The name Ortoten means "don't go there" in the local Mansi language. It is also ominously known as Dead Mountain. The trek officially started on January 27th, and just the very next day, one of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn around due to falling into illness. The remaining hikers embarked on their journey later in the day on February 1st, covering a mere 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles, before nightfall. Now remember, these young hikers were the best of the best at the time, so they knew they had to conserve their strength. They securely stored excess gear and provisions on a forest platform known as a labas, or camp base. They knew that snowstorms were common on these mountains, and in order to not risk any more members getting sick or getting stuck on the mountain with no cover, they knew they needed to rest for the night. By approximately 5 p.m., they had established their camp on a slope of Kholat-Syakhl, which is another name for the hillside of the mountain in the local language, situated about 10 kilometers or 10 miles from the summit of Ortoten. Dinner was prepared and served around 6 to 7 p.m., with 1 or 2 members of the group venturing outside the campground. Then, without warning, tragedy struck, and the course of their expedition took a catastrophic turn. Dyaltov had told Yudin before he turned around that they should reach the end of their journey around February 12th, but perhaps they would take a little bit longer. So that's the message Yudin told everyone. Messages took a while to receive, so everyone recognized that they had to give the group a few days of buffer room. However, the date passed, and there were no messages. Delays were common, especially during ice storms and big expeditions, but later came February 20th, and there was still no word from the hikers. The army, police, and many rescue teams were deployed to try and find the expedition. On February 26th, 25 days after the hikers departed, search and rescue teams found an abandoned and damaged tent. Word for word, the person who found the tent said, "The tent was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind." The strangest part about the tent was that it appeared to have been slashed open, but not from the outside. It was slashed open with a knife from inside the tent. Why would someone open their tent from the inside, just to leave all their belongings behind? The search team was puzzled and continued their search. The next day, 9 pairs of footprints were found, leading the search party away from the tents and down into some nearby woods. It was clear to the rescue workers that this was their missing party, but the shallow footprints in the snow suggested that the group of hikers descended in a calm fashion rather than with haste or panic. The footprints were followed for a third of a mile before the snow began to cover the footprints. They went toward the remaining footprints to find a cedar tree with remnants of an improvised campfire. And that's when they discovered 2 bodies in the snow. Remember, the belongings of the hikers in the tent that was slashed had their clothes neatly folded inside, so the search party wasn't surprised to see the bodies lying in the snow with minimal clothing on. Eventually, a medical examiner determined that one of the hikers had burn marks all over his body, and that there was a piece of flesh in his mouth. It wasn't just anybody's flesh, though. It was his own, because it looked like he had taken a bite out of his own hand. They looked closer at the cedar tree, and there were signs of damage on the base and 5 meters above the ground. It looked like someone had tried to climb it, but in the middle of a snowstorm, why would someone want to climb a tree? What were they trying to escape from? Or who were they trying to escape from? After some more time looking, the bodies of 2 more hikers were found by themselves. After researching the area, it was determined that their bodies were positioned in a way that seemed like they were trying to get back to their snow base. 3 more bodies were discovered and at least had their hiking clothing on, except they didn't have any boots, hats, or gloves. This made the decision of cutting the tent on the inside earlier more curious, because that meant that the clothes that were folded neatly in the tent weren't like that for every hiker on the trip. The bodies were also facing the same direction, going towards the original tent. Upon their first analysis, the 5 students appear to have died from hypothermia, and that somewhat explains the odd behavior of the group. Hypothermia can cause erratic behavior and also paradoxical undressing. This is a phenomenon in which those affected undress themselves because they feel hot, even though what is happening to their body is the complete opposite. The hikers were in the middle of a snowstorm, so they could have been acting crazy, but this theory doesn't support the fact that some hikers folded their clothes neatly in the tent and some were still wearing them. However, that doesn't fully explain why their clothes were neatly folded in their tent, why they would slash the inside of their tent to go outside, and why all of the bodies were in different places. Now, if you're counting at home, that's 5 out of the 9 hikers. So where were the other 4? It took rescue teams months to discover the next missing piece. They looked over the surrounding area of where the others were discovered, as well as the typical path that hikers would take throughout the route. It took until May 1959 for the other 4 bodies to be discovered. They were found by an indigenous Mansi hunter in a snow shelter. The odd thing was that out of the 4 remaining hikers' bodies, only 1 appeared to have died because of hypothermia. 2 of their chests were completely crushed, and their eye sockets were empty. One of the hikers' tongues was also missing. The other appeared to have a severe skull fracture, even having bone pieces stuck into his brain. These are not your normal injuries and behaviors that could have come from erratic behavior due to hypothermia. After further testing, all the bodies had something in common. They were all littered with traces of radiation. What could have caused this? Extraterrestrial beings? A weapons test gone wrong? When all the hikers were discovered, the investigation made a completely rational decision when it came to the hikers' mysterious deaths. The hikers all passed away from a compelling natural force. That's it. Case closed. Many believe that the Russian government was hiding something. Some believe it could have involved Yetis, or the KGB, or the CIA, or something to do with something we cannot explain yet. Or it could have been nature in the oddest way possible. But this was the most unlikely scenario. For now, this was the only answer we were going to get. That is, until the Russian government recently opened up the case yet again. In 2019, Andrei Kyuakov, the prosecutor for this new investigation, introduced a new theory. The slab avalanche theory suggested that the slope, Kholat Syakhl, was not steep enough for a traditional avalanche. Therefore, it's very possible that a slab of snow slid out of the mountain and landed over the tent. Due to surprise and weather conditions, the hikers may have feared a larger avalanche coming, so they quickly left the tent, leaving their belongings behind. The hikers may have walked without haste in order to keep their nerves calm, and then the hikers eventually started a fire and the snow shelter. Due to the storm, although it may not have caused an avalanche, it was still not the best weather conditions, which may have caused the shelter to collapse on the hikers. Animals could have ravaged the hikers' bodies, and the cold got to the rest of the hikers, as they were all most likely reeling from the collapse of their shelter. This theory was then tested in 2021 by Johann Guam and Alexander Puzurin, and they concluded that this theory was in fact possible. There's no way of proving it, and there's no way of knowing exactly what happened. All we know is that the hikers disappeared, and although their bodies were found, what happened to them remains a mystery. Imagine, it's 2014 and you're boarding an airplane for what seems to be the 100th time. Boarding Group C gets called up, your digital boarding pass gets scanned, and you wait in line to board the aircraft. After shuffling through the narrow aisle and placing your briefcase in the overhead compartment, the safety procedure begins shortly after. It's almost like a muffled sound, as it's so familiar that you can almost repeat it word for word. Then the flight attendant leans over the seat and asks your row, "Are you ready and willing to help out in an emergency?" You're seated in an exit row since your window is attached to the door that leads out to the cold Malaysian air. Everyone nods their heads, and then the flight begins for departure. You lean back and rest as the flight takes off in the dead of night on March 8, 2014, never to be seen again. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in the heart of Malaysia at 12:41 a.m. It was scheduled to land at Beijing Capital International Airport at 6:30 a.m. local time. The Boeing 777-2H-6ER aircraft carried 239 passengers, including 227 passengers and 12 crew members. The flight's pilot was Captain Zahare Ahmad Shah. He was a father, a grandfather, and a husband. He was 53 years old at the time of piloting, with over 18,000 hours of flight experience. His co-pilot was 27-year-old Fariq Abdul Hamed, who was engaged at the time and in the middle of planning his wedding. He had 2,763 flight hours under his belt. The passengers were made up of 14 different nations. All of the crew members were Malaysian. The manifest released by Malaysia Airlines also included an Austrian and an Italian. However, these men have been identified as Iranian nationals who used stolen passports to board the flight. At approximately 12:41 a.m., Malaysia flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur Airport. 26 minutes later, the pilot and aircraft sent their final automated position report. 12 minutes after that, the final voice transmission from the cockpit was received, which was, "Good night, Malaysian 370." This was a normal response, and everything seemed all well and good. When 6:30 a.m. rolled around, Beijing Capital International Airport was missing a plane. An hour later, Malaysia Airlines declared the flight missing. Following the declaration that MH370 was missing, a massive international search and rescue effort commenced. The initial focus was on the South China Sea, as that's when the plane disappeared from radar screens. Around 2:15 a.m. that evening, Malaysian military detected an unidentified object on its radar traveling west, but nothing was thought of it at the time. This information became public a week after the flight disappeared, and many believed that this was actually flight MH370. The search effort involved numerous countries, including Malaysia, China, Australia, and the United States, deploying ships, aircraft, and satellites to look for any signs of the plane. Days turned into weeks and then months, and no significant breakthroughs came when searching. With no physical evidence evident, investigators turned to satellites and electronic transmissions to try to find any information. On record, there were never any distress signals or indications that the flight was in any kind of danger. As of today, the plane's black box has never been found. An aircraft's black box is a device that records the cockpit's voice and is also a flight data recorder. If found, it could provide details on why MH370 went missing. However, a report came out stating that the battery in the beacon of the plane's flight data recorder was actually expired a year before the plane's disappearance, further adding to the mystery. The battery in the location beacon of the cockpit voice recorder is most likely to still be working, however. In 2018, a report came from the Malaysian government stating that MH370 actually changed course during its flight. The transponder for MH370 was turned off 2 minutes after their last broadcast, so it was difficult for investigators to locate an exact location, even after seeing the trajected course that the plane veered off from. The possible areas that the plane could have been found were so vast, and nothing was found. Investigators started to realize that the plane may never have landed safely and was instead crashed. In 2015 and 2016, debris from a plane washed up on the shore of the African coast and islands in the Indian Ocean. It was later confirmed that, with certainty, these parts were once part of flight MH370. No other parts have been found, and the possibility of a crash increases with evidence like this. Most of the search area was above the ocean, and with no other reports on land, it's very unlikely that anyone on board survived this deadly flight. One of the earliest unsolved mysteries of people disappearing was actually hundreds of years before we were all even born. The tale of the Roanoke colony revolves around the perplexing vanishing act they performed during the late 16th century. Nestled on Roanoke Island off the coast of what we call North Carolina today, the Roanoke colony began as an ambitious English settlement. The founder of the colony was Sir Walter Raleigh, who sent a group of colonists to settle in the Americas as the first permanent settlement. The group was governed by Ralph Lane, where Dare County is presently in North Carolina. The colony had a rough start to their community as they lacked supplies and established poor relations with the Native Americans in the area. Sir Richard Grenville was supposed to drop off extra supplies to them, but that mission was delayed. Ralph Lane had no choice but to abandon his colony and return to England in 1586. 2 weeks later, Sir Richard Grenville eventually made it to the colony, but also left back to England, having the first Roanoke colony marked as a failure. In 1587, John White set out to the same place and wanted to establish another settlement. Sir Walter Raleigh wanted to start the city of Raleigh in what is now known as Chesapeake Bay. It was also meant as a permanent settlement for colonists to settle, but there were even more problems than the first time. They were supposed to get resupplied every year, but England began the Anglo-Spanish War, which caused delays in the resupply of the colony. Tensions with the local Native American tribes rose even more, especially with the unknown status of the first ever settlement. John White brought over his daughter Eleanor Dare and her husband Ananias Dare. Their daughter Virginia Dare was going to go down in history as the first English child born in the Americas. However, John White couldn't stay due to the delays in supplies, so he had to go back to England in pursuit of aid. The Anglo-Spanish War turned out to be worse than expected and needed every ship available to aid in the fight. This is why White's absence from Roanoke stretched to 3 agonizing years. This proved to be his biggest mistake, because he did eventually return to Roanoke in 1590, but he was met with a haunting scene. The colony was completely deserted, devoid of any inhabitants or really any traces of life. The sole clue was etched into a tree and fence post. The cryptic inscription was the word Croatoan, which could really only indicate the neighboring Croatoan tribe, but it isn't known completely. There is a lack of any concrete evidence, and although there have been many theories, there is no traceable evidence to know exactly what happened to the Roanoke colony. Ashley Loring Heavy Runner was 20 years old when she was last seen in June 2017. She was a young woman who disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only questions and sadness. She was a member of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. She was last seen in Browning, Montana, where her disappearance sent shockwaves throughout her Native American community. She was described as smart, athletic, positive, and always willing to help, according to her mother. She was studying environmental science at Blackfeet's Community College before she vanished. She was very family-oriented, so Kimberly, Ashley's sister, knew something was wrong right away. Upon Kimberly's return from a 3-month stint in Morocco, a sense of foreboding washed over her. Plans to have Ashley move into her Missoula apartment were in place, yet Ashley's uncharacteristic silence upon Kimberly's arrival set off alarms. Frantic calls and messages to Ashley yielded no response, amplifying the family's anxiety. It was very unlike Ashley to just completely be unresponsive to her family. With mounting concern, Kimberly took matters into her own hands, leveraging social media to reach out to Ashley's friends in a desperate bid for any sign of her sister. The last sighting of Ashley, captured at a party on June 5th, offered a fleeting glimpse into her whereabouts. Even with the video, the trail ended up going cold. 2 weeks later, a tip emerged, painting a haunting image of a young woman fleeing from a vehicle on the desolate U.S. Highway 89. Despite an exhaustive 3-day search by Blackfeet law enforcement and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the mystery persisted. Feeling abandoned by authorities, Kimberly embarked on her own relentless pursuit, scouring the reservation day in and day out, determined to unravel the enigma surrounding her sister's disappearance. Prior to vanishing, Ashley grappled with personal demons stemming from the loss of her grandfather and a tumultuous breakup, leading her down a path of experimentation with drugs and association with an older crowd, including Sam McDonald. Sam McDonald, one of the last individuals to cross paths with Ashley, recounted their time together, culminating in Ashley's mysterious disappearance. They had been spending time together when she and Sam went for a car ride into the woods. He wanted to take her home because she was incoherent after being intoxicated with various drugs and alcohol. Her plea for a ride to meet V-Dog and directions to a nearby cabin raised eyebrows, leaving McDonald baffled as he awoke to find Ashley gone after falling asleep in his car. V-Dog, later identified as Paul Valenzuela, emerged as a person of interest, embroiled in a rocky relationship with Ashley's cousin T. As of now, law enforcement has refrained from naming any suspects or making any arrests despite reported sightings. A journalist from Montana, Rachel Crow Spreading Wings, recounted a chilling encounter she had a few weeks after Ashley's disappearance. While picking berries by the roadside, Rachel was approached by a disheveled woman bearing a striking resemblance to Ashley by description. The woman, seemingly intimidated by a man standing nearby, identified herself as Ashley. Sensing the unease, Rachel notified the police about the encounter, but no known follow-up was made. Her report vanished just as quickly as Ashley did in June of 2017. In the most isolated regions of Antarctica, where the freezing winds howl and the ice stretches as far as the eye can see, lies a place shrouded in mystery, known as Bird Station. For many decades, scientists from all over the globe have made the treacherous journey to this remote outpost in pursuit of knowledge. However, one scientist's discovery would eventually lead to a chilling disappearance that still has experts scratching their heads. Carl Robert Dish was a dedicated scientist from the National Bureau of Standards who was stationed at Bird Station. He was researching forward scatter, the deflection of waves that move in a way that heads towards the direction they came, in the harsh Antarctic winter. He frequently traveled between the main station complex and the radio noise building, so traversing in the frozen wasteland wasn't an issue. On the frigid morning of May 8, 1965, around 9:15 in the morning, Dish took off on his regular route from the radio noise building to the main station complex. His journey totaled about 7,000 feet, but his repetition and skill helped guide him better each time he took his expedition. This journey did not take very long, and once Dish failed to appear somewhere in the building, his colleagues started looking for him. At around 10 a.m., what should have been a normal route from the radio noise building to the main station turned into a nightmare for the workers at the station, and that's when the others spent time looking for Dish. Vehicles were deployed, and everyone else searched by foot as much as they could. By 11:30 a.m., the search and rescue team discovered a set of footprints going west of Bird Station. Just like most days in the Antarctic, the snowy, frozen conditions got worse, and the search party couldn't make a thorough course. Winds were reaching 25 to 30 knots, and all of the snow flying around made it difficult to see, as well as follow Dish's footprints inside. The search vehicles had to return back to the base to refuel at 6:15 p.m. By 7 p.m. that night, another search party was sent back out to try to look for Carl. They found nothing. After 50 minutes, they called upon all available hands to attempt a human chain search from the dump area of the base to the end of the skiway, but there were still no results. They fired flares every half hour, and they used their floodlights to try and see if they could spot any sign of Dish. The next day, they started to look for Dish again, searching a 1-mile by 9-mile wide area. Visibility was reduced to zero by heavy blowing snow and the seasonal darkness in the area. It was overcast, which made it difficult for men on the ground and vehicles to keep moving and commit to a strong effort search. The search parties couldn't find any trace of Carl Dish. They did find tracks in the snow and followed them for about 4 miles, but then they disappeared. They didn't notice any shortening of stride in the tracks, suggesting that the footprints could have gone on longer, but the conditions were so bad, they simply couldn't tell. The visibility got worse and worse, but those who came to Bird Station understood they couldn't just give up on finding Dish in the Arctic, because he was a prominent scientist, and colleague. They sent an 8-man search party equipped with 2 vehicles with enough resources to last a week into the frozen tundra to try and find Dish on May 10th. They went out 12 miles of the station, marking their checkpoints with flags. Even after a few days of searching, they didn't find anything. The next few days, the station personnel would search the other areas surrounding the base. Visibility got better, but the darkness of the area in the Arctic that they were stationed still caused problems. A fog loomed over the station, giving the rescue teams little hope on finding Dish. Carl left the radio noise building in full snow gear, suggesting that he might not have frozen to death since he was equipped for the weather. He was also well versed in surviving the snowy landscape, so he could be hiding out somewhere. But it was suggested that the tracks found near the base weren't headed in the right direction, and if they were Carl's, he was perhaps long gone. The base at Bird Station exhausted all of their efforts looking for Dish, but couldn't get a read on an exact location. With the snowy Antarctic conditions, time was of the essence to find Dish, but with each passing second, it became harder. Their vehicle's views were being obstructed by the snowstorm, and they eventually had to refuel back at their base. But by the time they were ready to head back out, the conditions got even worse. During their search efforts, temperatures in the area dropped to about negative 79 degrees Fahrenheit. Eventually, Dish was presumed deceased, but there is still no proof of that. Tragically, due to the prolonged exposure to the harsh Antarctic environment and the length of time since his disappearance, the rescuers could no longer spend their time trying to look for him. Memorial services were conducted in Antarctica as well as in his hometown by family and friends. The mystery surrounding Carl Robert Dish's disappearance serves as a poignant reminder of the unforgiving nature of the Antarctic wilderness and the risks inherent in scientific exploration in such remote environments.